December 19, 1944, the Ardennes. A frozen mist crawls through the wreckage of a Belgian village. The streets are silent except for the distant rumble of tank engines echoing through the fog. In the courtyard of a shattered farmhouse, an American M4 Sherman sits motionless, its olive paint scorched, its crew breathing in tight, shallow bursts. Inside, the gunner stares through a cracked periscope. Visibility almost zero. Somewhere out there, 3 German Panthers prowl their 75mm cannons capable of piercing the Sherman's armor from half a mile away. The Americans can't outrun them. They can't outgun them, but maybe they can outthink them. Every movement is calculated. Every second borrowed time. The radio hisses softly as the commander whispers orders, his voice steady but his hands trembling. Outside, a Panther's engine growls closer, its silhouette emerging like a beast through smoke and snow. 5 men. 1 tank, 3 Panthers. The odds were impossible, yet what happened next would leave even German officers stunned. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most desperate phase. The Allied armies, after storming ashore in Normandy 6 months earlier, were pushing deep into German-occupied territory. Hitler's once invincible Wehrmacht was retreating on multiple fronts from France, from the Low Countries, from Italy. Yet even as Berlin's shadow grew closer, the German army was far from defeated. Its soldiers still fought with ruthless precision, and its war machine, though battered, remained technologically superior in many ways. Among its deadliest weapons stood the Panther tank, sleek and lethal. Born from the lessons of early defeats against Soviet T-34s, the Panther's long-barreled 7.5 Semity WK-42 cannon could punch through Allied armor with terrifying ease. Its sloped frontal plating made it nearly invulnerable from the front. Crews trusted it like a fortress, fast, heavily armed, and engineered with German obsession for mechanical perfection. Across the battlefield, the Americans fielded a very different machine, the M4 Sherman. It was not elegant. It was not fearsome. It was a workhorse designed not to dominate, but to be built in thousands. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and adaptable to all conditions. But in direct combat with a Panther, it was almost always at a disadvantage. By late 1944, this imbalance had become painfully clear. In the hedgerows of Normandy, Sherman crews had learned the hard way that courage alone could not compensate for thin armor. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from over 2,500 meters. The Sherman's main gun, the 75mm M3, often needed to strike the enemy's flank or rear to even have a chance. And yet, Allied tankers kept fighting. They learned to use speed, teamwork, and terrain to survive. A Sherman's turret could traverse faster. Its radio coordination was superior. And unlike many German formations stretched thin and short on fuel, American crews had logistics, air support, and endless replacements. The Panther was a masterpiece. The Sherman was an army on wheels. Still, nothing could erase the fear. Every Allied tanker knew the silhouette of a Panther by heart, the sharp-angled hull, the low turret, the heavy gun that gleamed even through smoke. It haunted their dreams and dominated their war. In December 1944, the Ardennes forest, a quiet, snow-covered expanse along the Belgian-German border, was supposed to be a place of rest for many Allied divisions. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most shocking counteroffensives of the entire war, the Battle of the Bulge. At dawn on December 16th, the German army launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a massive surprise attack, through the dense woods and narrow valleys of the Ardennes. Hundreds of tanks, including Panthers, surged forward in blinding snow, aiming to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a political collapse among the Western Allies. Caught off guard, American units scattered. Communication lines broke down. Small groups of soldiers, tankers, infantrymen, engineers were suddenly isolated and surrounded. It was chaos. In these frozen forests, the Panther reigned supreme. On open roads, its gun made short work of Shermans. But in the twisting villages and snow-clogged fields of Belgium, the terrain began to even the odds. Panthers struggled with narrow streets and steep hillsides. Their heavy weight made them prone to bogging down or mechanical failure. And when visibility dropped, when fog and snow cloaked the land, the battle became less about range and firepower, and more about nerve and cunning. It was in this world of white silence and steel echoes that one American tank crew would soon face their moment. A crew hardened by months of combat, guided by instinct rather than hope. Their Sherman, perhaps a newer variant, an M4A376W, equipped with a more powerful 76mm gun, found itself stranded in a village already crawling with German armor. 3 Panthers prowled nearby, unaware that a single enemy machine still lurked among the ruins. They had no reinforcements. No air cover, no chance of retreat. Only their training, their discipline, and the element of surprise remained. In the cold heart of the Ardennes, amid smoke and snow, this was where technology met human resolve and where one tank crew would defy every expectation written in steel and fire. The clash took place in the bitter cold of the Ardennes counteroffensive, near the small Belgian village of St. Vith, one of the key road junctions that the German advance desperately needed to seize. St. Vith was defended by elements of the 7th Armored Division, 9th Armored Division, and fragments of infantry battalions hastily thrown together. Among them were tankers from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, whose Shermans had been fighting without pause since Normandy. By mid-December, the snow lay thick across the fields and temperatures plunged below freezing. Engines struggled to start. Fuel lines froze. Men fought not just the enemy, but the cold itself. Villages were reduced to blackened shells, their stone walls blown apart by artillery and tank shells. Amid this chaos, communication was often a luxury. Crews relied on instinct, on quick decisions made in the moment because a single wrong move could mean annihilation. The German plan was brutally simple. Panther and Tiger tanks from elite formations like the 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division, Bindhund, and Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were to spearhead deep thrusts through weakly defended sectors. The Panthers' task was to break through, bypass resistance, and create panic in the American rear. In contrast, the American armor was stretched thin. Many Shermans were supporting infantry in small towns, scattered and often cut off. Coordination was nearly impossible under constant shelling and Luftwaffe harassment. What saved the Americans from total collapse was not their armor, but their adaptability. Tank crews, platoon leaders, and even mechanics began improvising defenses, blocking roads with wrecked vehicles, setting ambushes with bazookas, and using every fold of terrain to neutralize the Panthers' long-range firepower. It was in one of these battered villages, possibly near Parker's Crossroads, Trois Ponts or Stavelot, that a single M4 Sherman crew found themselves isolated after their platoon was decimated. Their radio had been damaged by artillery fragments, and their supporting infantry had pulled back after a German assault. Through the fog they could hear engines deep growling. Unmistakably German, 3 Panthers, the crew's commander, likely a staff sergeant in his mid-20s, knew the situation instantly. They were trapped. In open combat they would last seconds, but in a village with rubble, narrow alleys, and blind corners they had one chance: to turn the terrain into a weapon. The setting around them was typical of the Ardennes villages: narrow cobblestone streets hemmed in by stone houses, church spires puncturing the fog, and walls thick enough to muffle the sound of an idling engine. Visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. The Germans, advancing methodically, would assume the town was already clear. That assumption would soon cost them dearly. Throughout the Ardennes campaign, many such duels unfolded in similar fashion. The Panther, designed for open-field warfare, struggled in tight urban confines. Its long gun often couldn't traverse freely between buildings. Its commander's visibility was limited, and reversing out of ambush positions was painfully slow. The Sherman, on the other hand, with its power traverse system and faster turret rotation, could engage more quickly once it had the drop on its target. The American crew knew all this. They had seen Panthers up close before. They knew that the only safe shot was from the side or rear, and that the first hit had to count while the rest of the front was in turmoil, with battalions retreating and villages changing hands by the hour. These 5 men prepared for the fight of their lives. They killed the engine. The cold crept in instantly. Breath turned to mist inside the steel hull. The gunner adjusted his sight, his fingers raw and stiff. Outside, the distant rumble of German armor grew louder, not just one tank, but several, their engines echoing through the fog like rolling thunder. Then came the sound they dreaded most: the crunch of tracks on frozen rubble. Growing closer, slow and deliberate, a shadow appeared between the ruins, the angular silhouette of a panther unaware of the American eyes watching it through a shattered wall. 3 against 1. In the logic of war, the outcome was already decided. But in the fog of the Ardennes, logic was often the first casualty. In the next moments, the American crew would use everything they had learned about speed, deception, and survival to turn the battlefield against their enemy. And as the first Panther moved into position, the quiet of the snowbound village broke into chaos once more. Inside the Sherman, the world was reduced to sound, vibration, and faith. A tank was not a single machine. It was 5 men breathing as one: commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver, each with a narrow window on the world, each responsible for a task so critical that a moment's hesitation could be fatal. In the claustrophobic interior, conversation was sparse. Orders were short, functional numbers, bearings, ranges. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and gunpowder residue. Yet within that small space, the crew found an unspoken rhythm forged through training and hardened by fire. Most American tank crews of late 1944 were young, barely out of their teens, but by the time of the Ardennes, many were veterans of Normandy's hedgerow fighting. They had learned to rely less on manuals and more on intuition. The official doctrine called for coordination between tanks and infantry, but the battlefield rarely allowed it. The Sherman's survival depended on how fast the crew could think when things went wrong. Their commander, perhaps a sergeant from Pennsylvania or Texas, had likely seen friends burned alive in previous encounters. The image of a Panther's shell slicing through a Sherman was seared into every tanker's memory. Yet experience had taught him something critical. Panthers hunted predictably. German tankers, trained under rigid doctrine, moved with caution and precision. They advanced in line, covering one another's arcs. Their tactics relied on superior range and accuracy, fighting from open ground where their guns could dominate. In villages, however, those advantages crumbled. The Panther's 75mm gun was long and powerful, but unwieldy among rubble and buildings. Its turret rotation was slower, its vision restricted. The American crew, by contrast, had learned to fight like guerrillas. They had been trained to exploit terrain to turn corners, conceal movement, and strike from unexpected angles. A Sherman was smaller, faster to aim, and its powered traverse system, driven by a hydraulic motor, could swing the turret twice as quickly as the Panther's manual crank. That difference, in a close-range fight, meant everything. As the 3 Panthers rolled into the village, the American crew would have listened carefully, not seeing them, but feeling their presence through vibration and echo. A trained ear could distinguish an engine's type and distance. The Panther's Maybach V12 emitted a deeper, harsher note than any Allied tank. It was a sound you never forgot. The commander would have judged their route, perhaps predicting that the Germans would use the main street to secure the crossroads. From their concealed position, the Sherman crew had to remain silent. Even the click of a radio or the clatter of a shell casing could betray them. Then came the tactical decision that defined them. They would not run, and they would not wait to be discovered. Instead, they would ambush. To survive, they had to think like hunters, not prey. The gunner adjusted his elevation, aligning the barrel toward a gap between 2 ruined houses. The loader placed a single armor-piercing round, the M62 APCBC, with a tungsten core capable of piercing the Panther's side armor at close range into the breech. The driver, crouched low, kept the engine off to stay silent. Every man in that steel box knew the stakes. The plan was simple. Wait for the first Panther to expose its flank, then fire once no more. If they missed, they'd die. Moments later, a dark shape emerged through the smoke. The first Panther crawled past the intersection, its commander scanning through the cupola. Its frontal armor, impervious to the Sherman's 75mm, faced away from them. Its side, the one vulnerable point, gleamed faintly through the haze. On target, the gunner whispered. The commander gave the word, a single steady order. When the Sherman's 76mm gun fired, the sound cracked through the fog like a thunderclap. The shell hit low, tearing through the Panther's thinner side armor, setting off a fire that bloomed orange in the white air. The German tank halted, smoke pouring from its hatches. The ambush had worked, but the noise had given away their position. The remaining 2 Panthers swung their turrets, searching for the source. The American commander shouted new bearings. The driver restarted the engine, backing them into a side alley just as a German shell punched through the wall they'd been hiding behind seconds earlier. This was the dance of survival attack. Move, vanish. In the confusion, the Germans couldn't tell where the fire had come from. They fired blind. their rounds demolishing empty buildings. Meanwhile, the American crew repositioned, threading through rubble-strewn alleys to strike again. It was here that the difference between doctrine and instinct showed its true cost. The Panthers, trained to fight as a unit, now hesitated. Their line had broken. Their formation dissolved in the fog. One turned left, another right, hunting shadows. Inside the Sherman, the loader slammed another shell home. The commander's voice remained calm, measured, unshaken even as masonry rained down from nearby impacts. What began as a hopeless situation was now turning into something else entirely. A contest of wits. The Germans had the power. The Americans had the moment. And in war, sometimes the moment was everything. To understand what happened in that village, one must understand the machines and the men who built them. The Panther and the Sherman were more than tanks. They were expressions of two entirely different philosophies of war. One was engineered perfection. The other, practical efficiency. One sought dominance through fear. The other, victory through numbers and reliability. The Panther, officially the Panzerkampfwagen, entered combat in 1943 after the Germans encountered the Soviet T-34. Its designers set out to create the ideal balance between armor, firepower, and mobility. The result was a 45-ton Predator with 80 mm of sloped frontal armor and the formidable 75 mm KWK-42 L-70 gun, a weapon of terrifying velocity and accuracy. Against almost any Allied tank, it was fatal before they could even return fire. Yet that power came with fragility. The Panther's suspension was complex, its transmission prone to failure. Its tracks, heavy and temperamental, often snapped under stress. In muddy fields or narrow roads, the Panther could become a prisoner of its own weight. It was, in essence, a high-performance machine built for a war that no longer had the luxury of precision. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, was born from the opposite logic. It was not the best tank, it was the right tank. Weighing just under 33 tons, it could be shipped, repaired, and replaced with astonishing ease. American industry produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, more than 10 times the number of Panthers. Spare parts were everywhere, and the simplicity of its design meant that any field mechanic could patch one up with basic tools. Technically, the Sherman was outgunned and under-armored. Its 75mm or 76mm gun lacked the penetration of German weapons, and its armor could rarely withstand a direct hit from a Panther. But the Sherman had two decisive advantages: speed of production and speed of thought. Its powered turret traverse, hydraulically operated, allowed it to aim and fire faster than any German counterpart. Its ergonomics were designed around crew efficiency. Where a Panther's interior was cramped and mechanically delicate, the Sherman's was logical and forgiving. The Americans built their tanks not for elite crews, but for mass-trained soldiers who could learn and adapt quickly. This difference in design philosophy directly translated to doctrinal contrast on the battlefield. German armor doctrine emphasized precision ambushes and ranged engagements, relying on their superior optics and long-range firepower. American doctrine emphasized mobility, communication, and combined arms. A Sherman was rarely alone, at least in theory. It was meant to operate with infantry, engineers, artillery, and air power working in concert. But in the frozen chaos of the Ardennes, that theory dissolved. Weather-grounded aircraft, radios failed, and isolated crews like the one in our story found themselves fighting the kind of battle they were never meant to fight face-to-face with German armor. This is where the second difference, psychological, became decisive. By late 1944, German tank crews were some of the most technically skilled in the world, but their morale was beginning to crack. They were fighting a losing war, short on fuel, short on replacements, and hunted by Allied fighter bombers every time they moved in daylight. Every engagement carried the weight of desperation. The Panthers rolling into that village were likely crewed by veterans, perhaps from the 2nd Panzer Division men, who knew their machines were powerful, but understood, too, that they were vastly outnumbered. The Americans inside the Sherman were the opposite. They were not elite, not heavily armed, but they were resilient. They had seen defeat and kept coming back. Their mindset was not built on invincibility, but adaptability, the confidence that somehow, no matter the odds, they could make something work. That psychological edge, the ability to improvise under fire, often turned the tide. The Germans respected this deeply. Many Panther commanders in post-war interviews remarked how American tankers fought with reckless courage and an uncanny knack for exploiting terrain. They called the Sherman inferior, but admitted that its crews were dangerous in close terrain because they moved like infantrymen in tanks, not like tankers in fortresses. And then there was the fog, both literal and metaphorical. In the Ardennes, visibility was often less than 200 meters. Engagements that should have favored long-range precision devolved into knife fights. A Panther's greatest asset, its gun, was only as useful as its commander's vision. The Sherman crew knew this. They used it. Each shot fired in that village was not just a gamble of steel, but of psychology. Every Panther commander who saw one of his comrades burning faced the sudden collapse of confidence, the realization that the prey had become the hunter. Confusion spread faster than fire. This interplay of machine and mind made such encounters legendary. On paper, the Panther was the perfect tank. In practice, war rewarded those who thought faster than they aimed. In those snowy ruins, the balance between engineering and human will tilted. The Sherman's underdog design, meant for mass production, meant for replacement, was suddenly the sharper tool. Because in that moment, it was man, not metal, that mattered most. The German crews advanced cautiously now, aware that something was wrong. Their radios crackled with reports of contact and unseen enemy. The psychological pressure shifted. Fear had entered the Panther's steel hull. And as they maneuvered to flank the unseen threat, they didn't realize the Americans had already moved again, preparing for the second strike. The fog thickened until even the burned-out ruins looked like ghosts. Somewhere beyond the main street, the second Panther rumbled into view, its cannon searching the village like a blind predator. The air stank of cordite and frost. Smoke still rose from the first Panther, its wreck casting a dull orange glow against the snow. Inside the Sherman, the 5 Americans sat in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint shimmer of the periscope glass. The commander, his throat dry, whispered coordinates to his gunner. They'd moved barely 50 meters since their first strike, sliding behind a collapsed wall and facing a narrow alley that led to the village square. They could hear the second Panther's gears whining. Its commander had seen the explosion and was maneuvering to flank whoever had fired. The Americans knew what that meant. Once the Panther's gun faced their position, they'd be vaporized. The Sherman's crew had to act first. The commander gave the order. The driver edged forward, crawling through the rubble until the barrel cleared the corner. The loader was already holding a high-velocity, armor-piercing shell, their best chance. Then came the moment that separated instinct from panic. The gunner couldn't see the Panther directly, only the faint heat shimmer through the mist. So he aimed by sound. Every tanker knew the rhythm of a Maybach engine, a distinct rumble that peaked just before the turret moved. "Wait," the commander whispered. He waited for the rumble to change pitch, that half-second pause before the Panther turned. Then quietly, fire. The Sherman's gun recoiled with a thunderous blast. The shell screamed down the alley, vanishing into the fog, and then a flash. The explosion echoed off the stone walls. They had hit it, but not hard enough. The Panther lurched, smoke pouring from its engine deck, but it didn't burn. It turned, angling its front toward the Sherman's position. "Back, back," the commander shouted. The driver slammed into reverse, the treads grinding against debris. The Sherman pulled back just as a 75mm shell tore through the wall in front of them, showering the tank in dust and bricks. A second shell followed, blasting a crater where they'd been seconds earlier. They turned down another side street, the driver steering by memory. He couldn't see a thing. The commander opened the hatch for a split second, snow whipping into his face. Through the haze, he spotted movement, the third Panther, moving in from the north side of the square, cutting off their escape. Now, they were boxed in. 3 streets converged ahead, each dominated by a Panther. The first was burning. The second was damaged but alive. The third was fresh, unscathed, and hunting. The American commander knew what had to be done, split their focus. He would use the village itself as a weapon. He ordered the driver to take position behind a low barn at the intersection's edge. The loader switched to a smoke round a rare but invaluable tool. When fired, it wouldn't destroy, but it would blind. The idea wasn't to kill, not yet. It was to make the enemy hesitate. The gun roared again, and a plume of white smoke erupted across the street, cloaking the Sherman's position. Through the haze, the German tankers fired blind, their shells smashing into empty houses. The Americans used those seconds to slip around the barn and take cover behind a church wall. Then silence. The battle paused, both sides listening. The wind carried the creak of metal cooling, the soft hiss of steam from damaged engines. Somewhere a bell half hung from a shattered steeple chimed faintly in the cold. The commander looked at his gunner. "Next shot counts," he said quietly. The loader inserted another armor-piercing shell, hands trembling from exhaustion and cold. Through the periscope, the gunner caught a glimpse of a dark shape emerging through the smoke, the second Panther limping into view, its side armor glinting faintly beneath a broken balcony. The commander whispered, "Up 5 degrees left, 2. The gunner adjusted. The sight crosshairs steadied on the glowing target. Fire. The shell slammed into the Panther's side just below the turret ring. There was a blinding flash, then a detonation that ripped open the hull. Flames erupted skyward. The explosion threw debris across the street, shaking the Sherman like a wave. The second Panther was gone, but the third now knew exactly where they were. From the far end of the village, its engine howled louder, closer. The sound of treads crushing stone echoed through the alleys. The commander could feel the vibration in his boots. They had no time to move. He ordered the driver to angle the tank slightly behind a stone fountain. It wouldn't stop a shell, but maybe, just maybe, it would distort their silhouette. The gunner's hands hovered over the elevation control, waiting for the enemy to appear. Outside, the world was a blur of fog, snow, and the low, growing growl of German steel. The third Panther was coming for them alone, enraged, and ready to finish what the others could not. And deep inside the Sherman's steel hull, 5 men prepared for the most precise shot of their lives. The third Panther advanced cautiously, its gun sweeping left and right, hunting through the fog. The commander inside was no novice. He'd already seen 2 of his division's tanks destroyed in minutes from an unseen enemy. Now every shadow was suspect. The massive steel beast crawled down the main street, turret trained on the church ruins, its gun barrel cut through the haze like a spear. German infantry followed at a distance, hugging walls, rifles ready. The Panther's engine echoed against the stone buildings, a steady, menacing heartbeat that seemed to fill the air itself. Inside the Sherman, breath condensed on steel. The crew could hear every vibration. The commander knew they couldn't fire first this time, not yet. The Panther's frontal armor was angled like a shield of iron. Any shell against it would ricochet. They would have to wait for the perfect moment again. The commander lowered his voice. "Hold, don't move!" The driver froze. The engine ticked softly in the cold. Even a single vibration might give them away. Through the periscope, the gunner could see the flicker of the Panther's exhaust flames maybe 120 meters away, crawling toward them. It stopped, turret turning slightly. A shell exploded against the church wall just a few meters from the Sherman's hiding spot, spraying shards of stone across its hull. The crew didn't flinch. Not yet. Then came a stroke of luck, or perhaps instinct. The Panther's commander, believing the church was empty, ordered his driver to advance and swing left to clear the square. For just a second, the tank's side armor, its Achilles heel, was exposed. That was the window. "Target left side, mid-hull," the commander barked. The gunner's hands moved fast. The loader slammed in an M62 armor-piercing round, the last they had in easy reach. "Up 2 degrees, fire!" The Sherman's cannon thundered, the recoil smashing back into the gunner's shoulder. The shell streaked across the narrow street, vanishing into the fog, and then struck home. A dull, solid impact followed by a roar. The round had hit low, piercing the Panther's ammunition rack. Fire erupted through its rear vents, followed by a violent secondary explosion as the stored shells ignited. The blast shattered windows 100 meters away. The Panther lurched, its turret twisting wildly, then slumped to a stop, black smoke pouring from its hatches. The American crew didn't cheer. They didn't have time. German infantry, stunned by the sudden destruction, scattered for cover. Some fired blindly toward the church. The Sherman reversed again, slipping behind the ruins before a Panzerfaust or rifle grenade could find it. Inside, the commander lowered his head, exhausted. The gunner exhaled, shaking from adrenaline. The loader sat motionless, eyes on the glowing breach. For the first time since dawn, silence returned to the village. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. The only sound was the crackle of flames and the soft hiss of snow melting on hot metal. The fog began to lift, revealing 3 Panthers burning amid the ruins, a grotesque stillness after hours of chaos. The commander finally opened his hatch. The cold air hit like a knife, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. Smoke drifted across the square. The German infantry had vanished into the forest. 3 Panthers, the pride of Hitler's armored divisions, lay silent, destroyed by a single Sherman that should not have survived the first 5 minutes. Reports later described the engagement as extraordinary, though few details were ever officially recorded. Incidents like it occurred across the Ardennes, where isolated crews turned hopeless situations into legends. Whether this crew belonged to the 3rd Armored Division, the 740th Tank Battalion, or another small unit lost in the fog, their feat embodied the desperate improvisation that defined the winter of 1944. Technically, the victory was almost impossible. Even at point-blank range, the Sherman's guns struggled against the Panthers' armor. But terrain, smoke, and confusion had leveled the field. The Americans had used ambush tactics, speed, concealment, and constant repositioning to destroy enemies that should have crushed them. German after-action reports mention such incidents with disbelief. One Panther commander wrote that, "The Americans fought with a strange cunning, appearing where they could not be, and firing from the shadows." It was not the words of admiration, but of frustration. When the smoke finally cleared that afternoon, the Sherman crew emerged to rejoin what was left of their battalion. Their tank was scarred, its paint scorched, antenna bent, periscope cracked. But it still ran, and that alone felt like a miracle. They would not be celebrated in newspapers. Their names would fade into unit logs and after-action notes. But among their peers, among the other tankers who had seen what a Panther could do, their story would spread quietly. One Sherman, 3 Panthers. It became a whisper of defiance in a war dominated by fearsome machines, a reminder that sometimes a crew's coordination and courage could outweigh every disadvantage written in steel. As night fell, the burned wrecks glowed faintly in the snow, their silhouettes standing like tombs in the fog. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of new armor echoed again, the war far from over. But for that single frozen day in the Ardennes, 5 Americans had done the impossible, and the Germans, stunned by what they had seen, could scarcely believe it. The smoke lingered for hours. By nightfall, the snow around the burning Panthers had turned black with soot, their hulls still glowing faintly in the cold air. The quiet was unsettling. No more artillery, no more engines, only the soft crackle of melting metal and the hiss of cooling armor. The surviving Sherman stood like a ghost among ruins. Its crew had long since dismounted, their uniforms stiff with frost and grease. They gathered near the church wall, sharing the last of their water and rations. The commander, exhausted, filled out a brief after-action note in his small field log, the kind used for minor skirmishes. He listed enemy tanks destroyed, ammunition expended, and casualties. None. He didn't bother to write what the crew had truly endured. When dawn came, American reinforcements reached the village engineers, medics, and a column of half-tracks from a neighboring unit. They stopped in disbelief at the sight. 3 Panthers, all destroyed in a tight radius, each from clean, precise shots. One by one, soldiers climbed onto the hulks, tracing the burn marks and entry holes. "How the hell did you do this?" someone asked. The Sherman commander just shrugged. "Got lucky," he muttered, but luck alone couldn't explain it, reports from the 3rd Armored Division later noted that several small tank crews had achieved surprising tactical successes against German armor during those desperate days of December 1944. They credited terrain, weather, and quick maneuvering, but those who'd fought knew the truth. Survival demanded more than tactics. It required nerve. For the Germans, the losses were harder to justify. The Panther was the pride of their Panzer divisions, a weapon of engineering superiority. Losing 3 in a single engagement to an American Sherman, a tank they had long mocked as Tommy Cooker or Ronson, was humiliating. German officers examining the wrecks assumed they had fallen to artillery or aircraft. Only later did reconnaissance confirm the kills came from another tank, concealed within the village. An intelligence report from the 2nd Panzer Division described the event tersely. Enemy employed unorthodox ambush tactics. 3 WWII lost. Crew reported no visual contact before engagement. The phrase "no visual contact" summed up what made the encounter so unnerving. The Panther's greatest strength, its long-range precision, had been neutralized in fog and close quarters. The Americans had forced the fight into a knife-range duel where reflex, not armor thickness, decided who lived. In military academies, post-war analysts would later describe such incidents as examples of micro-level asymmetric engagements, moments when a smaller, weaker unit exploited situational advantage to defeat a stronger opponent. In the Ardennes, those moments were often the only thing that kept the American line from breaking entirely. Psychologically, the story spread fast among frontline tankers. Crews from the 740th 4th Armored and 33rd Armored Battalions heard about the Sherman that took out 3 Panthers. Nobody knew the names or the exact coordinates, but the legend boosted morale at a time when every inch of ground was contested. For men who spent their nights inside freezing tanks, the idea that a Sherman could win such a fight meant something. It meant hope and a reason to keep climbing back into machines they knew were outclassed. The Panther crews, on the other hand, began moving with more caution. Several captured German prisoners told interrogators that American tanks had become unpredictable, striking from unexpected angles and disappearing before counterfire could land. The myth of the all-powerful Panther began to crack not by superior firepower, but by audacity. Still, in the scale of the war, this was only a flicker, one battle among thousands. The Ardennes would remain contested for weeks, its fields littered with burned-out tanks of every nation. Yet even in such chaos, small victories mattered. The destruction of those 3 Panthers did not change the course of the Battle of the Bulge, but it revealed a shift in mindset. The Americans were no longer the inexperienced tankers of North Africa or Normandy. They had learned, adapted, survived. And sometimes, survival itself was victory. As the sun rose over the ruined village, engineers marked the destroyed Panthers for recovery. Snow drifted over their hulls, softening their outlines, erasing the violence that had consumed them. The Sherman's crew climbed back into their tank and drove east toward another line, another ambush, another day they might not return from. The war moved on. But the memory of that duel lingered not as triumph, but as testament, because even the most fragile machine can become unstoppable when guided by men who refuse to die quietly. In the days that followed, the American advance through the Ardennes resumed its slow, grinding pace. The German offensive, once fierce and unstoppable, began to lose momentum. Fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and relentless Allied counterattacks turned Hitler's last gamble into a desperate retreat. But within the armored ranks, the lessons of those small duels, the kind fought in nameless villages like this one, began to resonate deeply. The U.S. Army's after-action analyses compiled in early 1945 revealed a critical truth. Success in tank warfare wasn't dictated solely by hardware, but by adaptability. The Sherman, dismissed for its thin armor and modest gun, had proven lethal in the hands of crews who used terrain, concealment, and timing to their advantage. Commanders studying reports from the Ardennes noticed a pattern. Crews who relied on conventional line-of-sight tactics were slaughtered by Panthers and Tigers. But those who moved unpredictably, who turned the battlefield into a chessboard of deception, often emerged victorious. The Sherman's mobility, once overlooked, had become its greatest weapon. This shift marked a turning point in Allied armored doctrine. Training programs in 1945 began emphasizing ambush warfare, camouflage discipline, and fast relocation after each shot, lessons written not in manuals, but in the survival stories of crews like the one that outwitted 3 Panthers. On the German side, the engagement served as a grim warning. Reports circulated through Panzer command units about the increasing aggressiveness and ingenuity of American crews. While still technologically inferior, the Allies were adapting faster than the Reich could counter. By late January, as the German offensive collapsed, many Panther crews began fighting defensively, ambushing from wooded ridges or village outskirts rather than charging headlong. It was an ironic reversal. The same tactic that had once defined German blitzkrieg was now being used against them. Historians would later argue that these small, seemingly isolated engagements illustrated a broader truth, that innovation in warfare rarely comes from the top. It emerges in the chaos of battle, from soldiers who refuse to follow the script. For the men inside that Sherman, the fight ended when their tank rolled out of the village. But their story, retold in mess halls, unit reports, and post-war interviews, became a microcosm of the larger American evolution in armored warfare. When the war finally ended in May 1945, surviving tank crews were debriefed across Europe. One recurring theme appeared in those interviews: respect for the enemy's machines, but pride in the crew's own ingenuity. A former Sherman commander from the 740th Tank Battalion summed it up simply: "The Germans built better tanks. We built better crews." That mindset carried into the post-war years. The U.S. Army began developing the next generation of armor, the M26 Pershing, designed to finally match the Panthers and Tigers in firepower. But even then, engineers and officers alike stressed that technology alone wouldn't win the next war. The legend of the outnumbered Sherman crew became part of that philosophy, a reminder that courage, cunning, and cohesion could turn the tide even when the odds were absurd. In Germany, few Panther veterans ever learned exactly what had happened in that fog-shrouded village. For them, the memory was buried among countless other defeats in the Ardennes, but the psychological impact lingered. The Panther, once a symbol of invincibility, had shown its limits not just mechanically but strategically. The battlefield was changing. Precision machines could no longer guarantee victory. Human instinct, the ability to think, improvise, and risk everything in seconds, had reclaimed its place at the center of modern warfare. When military historians in the 1950s began chronicling the Battle of the Bulge, they found dozens of accounts like this one: obscure, unheralded moments where ordinary crews defied the statistics. Most names were lost, but the echoes remained. A single tank crew, surrounded by superior enemies, refusing to yield. It was not just a story of one battle, but of an idea that technology may dominate the field, but it is men who decide its fate. And as those burned-out Panthers were finally hauled away for scrap, buried under snow and memory, one truth endured in the freezing forests of Belgium. In the hearts of those who fought there, sometimes survival itself is the greatest victory. In the vast machinery of war, history often remembers the giants, the mighty armies, the generals, the grand offensives. But sometimes the purest measure of courage comes from a single tank sitting alone in the snow. That day in the Ardennes was not recorded as a major victory. No medals were handed out, no parades followed. Yet, in that fog-covered village, 5 men in an aging Sherman showed the world something that charts and statistics could never explain: that in the face of overwhelming power, the human mind remains the most unpredictable weapon of all. Their battle was a fragment of a much larger struggle, a moment swallowed by time, by the roar of greater wars and the silence that followed. But within that moment lay the essence of survival: calm under terror, instinct under chaos, unity under fire. Every tank war, since from Korea to the Middle East, has carried echoes of that lesson. Technology evolves, armor thickens, firepower multiplies, but the battlefield still bends to those who can think faster than fear. The German Panther was a marvel of engineering. The American Sherman was a compromise of necessity. Yet on that frozen morning, it was not steel or horsepower that decided the outcome. And that is why stories like this endure, not as tales of triumph, but as reminders that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes quietly inside a darkened tank, waiting for the right moment to strike back. When historians look at the Battle of the Bulge, they see numbers, divisions, casualties, supply lines. But behind every statistic lies a face, a name, a heartbeat that refused to stop. In the end, the war rolled onward, consuming cities, empires, and ideologies. Yet somewhere in the smoldering remains of that Belgian village, the legacy of 5 unknown men survived not in monuments, but in the idea they proved true: that even when the world is burning and the odds are impossible, a handful of determined souls can still change the course of history, if only for one fleeting, unforgettable moment.